Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be talking about seventh chords, but there's a little bit of a twist in the tail as to how I want to talk about them. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves of the conventional wisdom on seventh chords. So if you want to create seventh chords in the key of C major, for example, well, the best way to do this is write out a scale of C major. You don't particularly need the top note because it would be C and that's the same as the bottom note. And then construct your basic triad. So putting a third and a fifth above each note. And just to double check that you've got this right, you should have 3 consecutive spaces or 3 consecutive lines. So those are my chords, and we tend to label these in Roman numerals just like this. So this is probably very familiar territory to most people. We can also extend our chords. So in other words, we're piling up our chords in thirds. You know, if I look at chord 1, then C to E is a third. C, D, E, that's a third. E to G is another third. E, F, G. So if I extend it, G, A, B, then the next third is going up to this B. All right, so this is what we're talking about, extended chords. We can add a seventh above the bottom note, or a ninth, or an 11th, or a 13th. When we get to 15, we're back on the note we started with, so there's no point in going beyond all of that. But you can see how this principle of chord extension works. And the first point of extension is to take a chord to a seventh. So I've got what we call a root, a third and a fifth, and then a seventh. A root, a third, a fifth, then a seventh. And so we go on. And again, you see, we either have a pile of consecutive lines or consecutive spaces. So what does all this sound like so far? Well, without the sevenths, chord 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Add the sevenths, 1, 7, 2, 7, 3, 7, 4, 7, 5, 7, 6, 7, 7, 7. So all I'm doing there is adding a seventh onto each of the basic chords. Now that is the conventional wisdom on seventh chords. So it's important to know that that's how we normally do things. What I want to talk about in this video is, well, what happens instead of adding a third at the top of the chord, if we kind of do this upside down and think about adding a third at the bottom of the chord. Right, what am I talking about now? Well, let's just plot what we've just done. So we do the same thing. We've got our C major scale and we build our triads, third and a fifth above each note. So we're in business there. So you can see how this works. But, I'm sorry, that should be not the clearest G. Never mind, you know what I mean. But this time, instead of putting a seventh on top as we did originally, I'm going to put an extra third on the bottom of the chord. Oh, right, so how is this going to work? Well, we're going to go down a third from the bottom note and do this. So you might think it's a slightly wacky idea, but of course what it does is it kind of changes the nature of the seventh chord, doesn't it? Because instead of this first chord being a chord 1 something now, actually what I've done is to turn it into a 6/7 chord. Does that make sense? And this one is now turned into a 7/7, and this is turned into a 1/7, and so on. I suppose I better just label them all. So we've got all this. So they're still absolutely recognized chords, and they're exactly the same chords as the chords we had in the first row. So is there some advantage in adding this extra third at the bottom to create a seventh chord instead of the conventional way of adding the seventh at the top of the chord? Well, I think there is, because there are things you can do with this. Let me give you an example. Say you're writing a piece of music in C major and you use a chord 4. I'll just put it in its basic triadic form for the time being. So there's a chord 4. Well, you could be thinking, well, what shall I do next? You could think, well, I could make that a slightly richer chord and turn it into 4/7 by adding the 7th at the top. And then maybe that will resolve onto, say, a chord 5. Well, so that would be chord 4, chord 4/7, onto a chord 5. So that's one way in which you can use these sevenths, to start with a plain triad, an ordinary chord, enrich it by adding the 7th, and then kind of think, well, where does that want to go? Where's the voice leading taking me? You know, what's the note that wants to follow this note? So you could do that. But how about you did this in the opposite direction, so the upside down 7th technique, if you like, where you start with your chord 4 in just the same way, but this time, instead of adding that 3rd at the top, you add the 3rd at the bottom, so it becomes a 2/7 chord. So you've got chord 4, add the 3rd at the bottom, becomes a 2/7, and then go on to your 5 from there. I mean, it might need a slightly different spacing. For example, you might end up doing something like this to go to your 5, just because of the voice leading. You know, that 7th at the top of the 2/7 chord here sort of wants to fall by step. So you sort of take that into account in the way you deal with it. So you see what I'm getting at? That if you start with a 4, and then you're thinking, well, I'm not quite sure what chord to use next. Well, you could move to a different chord. But one advantage of doing this is that if you drop to a 2/7, well, you end up with all the notes of your chord 4 still sounding, and all you're doing is adding a note, but changing the chord. And the difference between that and the conventional way of doing things is this. If you take chord 4 and you make it 4/7, well, okay, you've enriched the chord by adding that 7th above, but you've essentially got the same chord again. Nothing wrong with that at all. If you go from 4 to 4/7 to 5, sounds really cool. But actually, if you want to change the chord, but you don't want it to be too radical a change, you kind of take the chord, you want to warm up the chord, but you want to have the same chord notes in common, that's when it's quite useful to think, oh, I could start with 4, drop to 2/7, and then go to 5. So you end up with a 3-chord progression over 3 chords instead of a 2-chord progression. Nothing wrong with a 2-chord progression, but sometimes it's quite interesting just to think, oh, that could be quite a handy thing to do. And if you get the idea here, well, you know, you could do this with any of the chords. Some might be more successful than others. Like if I take chord 1, I could put that 3rd on the bottom and make it a 6/7. Well, that's a nice progression, isn't it? Going from C to A minor 7. Then you've got to think, well, where does it really want to go? It probably wants to go on to a D minor 7 or a 2/7. So C major or chord 1, A minor 7 or 6/7 on to D minor 7 or 2/7. Gives you a nice progression, doesn't it? So you could do that. You could take chord 2, that's the D minor chord. If you add the 3rd on the bottom, you've got to be a little bit careful because you've now basically got a diminished chord, a chord 7, but it's because it's a 7/7, it works okay in root position. Normally diminished chords are better if you've got them in first inversion, but when it's got a 7th on it, it's okay. So you can start with a chord 2, you can add that 7th on the bottom and it pulls you into a chord 1. You can hear that voice leading going nicely, those outer parts kind of pulling in. So 2 to 7/7 coming into 1. Quite a nice sound, isn't it? What happens if you take chord 3? So that's an E minor chord, and then you add that 3rd on the bottom, so it becomes a C7 or a 1/7. Well, you could do something like chord 3 or the E minor chord onto chord 1/7 or the C7 and go to a D minor chord or a chord 2. These are not exhaustive possibilities. I'm just exploring some of the things that might want to happen. where you're really listening to the parts, thinking voice leading. Where does this line want to go? Does that note want to go down one? Does it want to go up one? That's essentially what voice leading is. We've talked about chord 4 already, so I'll miss that out for now. Chord 5 is a G major chord, G, B, D. So if I add that extra third on the bottom, it gives me a 3/7 or an E minor 7. Well, that goes on quite nicely this way. If you go from the G major or the 5 to the E minor 7 or the 3/7, it goes on to a 6/7 rather beautifully, an A minor 7. So it gives you a kind of nice progression. You can hear what's happening here. What about chord 6? A minor chord, A, C, E. Add on that third on the bottom. I get an F7 chord, an F major 7 chord, of course, it's a 4/7, so I can go from 6, that A minor, to this 4/7, and that goes on quite nicely to chord 5, doesn't it? So you see what's going on there. 7, be careful with, because the basic 7 without a 7th of its own is a diminished chord, therefore tends to be a little bit ugly. You know, when you've got that in root position, put it in first inversion, sounds much better. So chord 7 is the least successful chord in terms of adding this third on the bottom. It's not impossible. You can start with that 7, and of course when you add that third below, you end up with a G7 or a 5/7, which itself is a very strong chord. And from there you can progress on, so you know, that's okay. The trouble is that 7 on its own just sounds like a sort of weak 5/7. So that's the least successful one to go with. But anyway, I'm hoping this is making some sense. The way these things are always taught is the conventional way that we talked about first of all. You take your chords, your triads for a key, you add on a 7th on the top of it, and if you want to extend further, you can put 9ths on the top of them, you can put 13ths on the top of it, and on you go. But just think about this possibility of, instead of putting the extra third on the top, put the extra third on the bottom. It's an unconventional piece of thinking, but it's one that I think sometimes saves the day. And it's this thing about the fact that when you put a 7th on top of a triad, you are enriching the chord, but you're not changing the chord. When you kind of add this third on the bottom of the triad, you are actually changing the chord. So if you do it to chord 4, it becomes chord 2/7. So you have all these notes in common, which is a lovely smooth transition from one chord to the next. But because you change the chord, it kind of moves the harmonic landscape on in some way. So sometimes you kind of want to move from one chord to another chord. And this is a great way of doing it, as opposed to thinking, well, I've got this chord 1 and I've added a 7th. It works, but I'm kind of stuck with the same chord. So you might find this quite a useful little tool to play around with. So it's kind of what I'm calling upside down 7ths. That's not a term you're going to read in any textbook. It's not something I've ever really heard anybody talk about, to be honest, but it's just something that I've worked with over the years and actually found quite a useful way of doing things. So whether you're writing your own song or whether you're trying to harmonize a chorale in the style of Bach, you know, whatever it is, it's another way of thinking, I've got, you know, maybe a repeated note in a melody, and I've got chord 4 and I've got repeated C in the melody. Oh, I could hop to 2/7. Might be one way of doing it. So you might want to change the chord and just stick with the basic triads, but it's just another tool in your toolkit as a composer, harmonizer, arranger, or whatever you're up to musically. So I hope that's a helpful way of thinking about 7th chords, but upside down 7ths. Have fun with your upside down 7ths. And if you've enjoyed this video, you might want to go onto our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And there's one course I'm going to recommend to you. So go to the website, click on courses, and go to keyboard harmony. Because if you want to get this chord stuff going really well under your fingers, then the keyboard harmony course is the course for you. It will get you really good with doing all of this stuff. So have a look at that and see if it's for you. www.mmcourses.co.uk. UK.